Welcome to Eastern Europe's Minorities in a Century of Change, a podcast on the history of minority experiences in Central and Eastern Europe during the 20th century. This series is part of the Institute of Historical Research's centennial commemorations, Our Century, Looking Back, Thinking Forward, and has been organized by the study group. It was made possible through the help and support of the British Association of Slavonic and East European Studies and the Stanley Burton Centre for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Leicester. The study group is a forum devoted to researching minorities in the national and regional histories of Central and Eastern and Southeastern Europe and to promoting closer scholarly collaboration. For more information, please visit our website at studygroupforminorityhistory.com. I am Jan Rybak, Early Career Fellow at the Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Antisemitism in London. Today, I will be speaking to Markus Silber, Professor of Jewish History at the University of Haifa and Chair of the Gotteiner Institute for the History of the Bund and the Jewish Labour Movement. We will be talking about the Jewish experience and Jewish responses to ethnonationalism and exclusion in Eastern and Central Europe in the early 20th century. Markus is the author of, among other works, Leumut Shuna, Israhut Shava, Hamaemet lehasagat autonomia leyehudei Polin b'milchemet haolam harishona, Different Nationality and Equal Citizenship, the efforts to achieve autonomy for the Jews of Poland during the First World War. He is currently preparing a book on Jewish national councils, autonomous national institutions, and a struggle for national autonomy in post-World War I Europe. So Markus, welcome to the podcast. Can you start by telling us a little bit about yourself and how you became interested in this particular aspect of history?
Thank you, Jan, for giving me the opportunity to talk about this topic with you and the listener. And I began being very interested in questions of minorities in Eastern Europe when I made my MA studies at the University of Tel Aviv University. My advisor was very interested in the question of minorities in the Ukraine during First World War and before. And the mechanisms of national autonomy that were implemented in the Ukraine during the period of the revolutions. When I began my PhD studies with him as the advisor, I was very interested in the questions of the implementation of autonomy in the Ukrainian Republic during 1917-1920. But at the beginning of my research, I found rich sources that were completely unknown dealing with these questions in Congress Poland, occupied by Germany during World War I. And because of these sources, I shifted my focus from the Ukraine to Poland, or to Poland and Lithuania under the German occupation. Finally, I was more focused on Poland, despite that I also made research on Lithuania under the German occupation. The questions of minorities is a question that is fascinating, and is fascinating me for a long period. It is probably the reason when I learned history, I specialized in Jewish history in general, or in Jewish history. In many aspects, the question of looking through the Jewish experience is a good way to understand the experience of minorities, especially these minorities that are in many ways othered, often in the West in general, in Europe in particular. Probably it's related that I am coming from, I was born in Argentina, coming from Yiddishist and secular Jewish family, that I grew up in Yiddish schooling in a Spanish environment, and that made me from the very beginning very sensitive to the questions of people with different languages and different cultural approaches, or even ideological approaches, in a state that presents itself as homogeneous, despite that it's very heterogeneous, like many other modern states.
Fantastic. I would actually have an immediate follow-up question to that, because you spoke about how studying of the Jewish experience is important to for us learning also about other minorities' experiences. Maybe to go a step further in that, what do you think the study of minorities, the Jewish experience and minorities' experience, can tell us about the wider stories of these regions that, as you said, are so often conceived as homogeneous societies, or at least nationalists viewed them these ways, and nationalist historiographies. What does a wider European or East Central European historiography gain from looking at minorities and their responses to crisis?
I think that looking at minorities is a good way to understand minorities, or what we call minorities, and a way to understand what majorities are, and how majorities are presenting themselves, and what are the blind spots in the mainstream majorities discourse that should be addressed. Also, when we are talking about a society that is very heterogeneous, of course, with many linguistic, religious, class, gender aspects, that when looking through the hegemony, they are ignored. In some way, when we are talking, that reminds me when the question about what Polish history is. Polish history is the history of the people receding along the centuries on what we used to call the Polish lands, or the people that they are calling themselves Poles through the ages, or what the people that we used to call Poles, retrospectively. Yeah? And I think that it is looking through the minorities, we can understand how complicated is also this group that is called majority. And of course it is more inclusive because when we are talking about a society looking only through the hegemonic ethno-national or ethno-religious or ethno-linguistic lens, we are missing a big part of the story, and I would say even the most interesting part of the story. One of the things that I think that it is interesting when we are looking through the minorities lens, and again, when I am talking about minorities, I'm not talking only about ethno-national minorities or ethno-linguistic minorities, or ethno-religious minorities. We are gaining some understanding about other possible ways of the history. We sometimes we understand developments that the logic only or the has a logic outcome of previous events. But in many cases, there are many other paths and ways, and people at some point preferred to go through one specific way. Looking through the lens of the minorities, we can understand other paths and other ways that could be better, could be worse, but other possible choices for the people living at some point in some place, specific place and point. That is the reason I think that they are interesting. Regarding the Jews, I think that it is what is in many cases, especially in Christian Europe, during ages, in many ways, the Jews are the ultimate other. And that is the reason that it is interesting, because it is an other that is very local, but is very othered. And in many cases, I think that the Polish case is one of them, but not the only one, the Jews were kind of mirror to define who are us the majorities, us, not them, the Jews. And that is the reason I think that, again, the Jewish prism is interesting to understand European culture in a much broader level.
Fantastic. Another question relating to your work. So in your book, you describe the role of the First World War in Eastern and Central Europe in bringing about new questions relating to the standing of minorities in society in the new states that would be created after the war. Could you explain the significance of this war and what came after it a bit further?
Well, I think that I think that many people will agree with me that First World War changed the world. It is the beginning of a new era. That probably we are still in this, I would say, sad era. It was the destruction of the construction of heterogeneous big states. It was the end of some dreams about some perceptions of equality, some perceptions of freedom, some perceptions of fraternity. This concept that we are begin to being popular after the French Revolution, and it is a reconceptualization of each of these concepts, and in the frame of a new political construction following the collapse of the three big or four big European empires. We are taking also the Ottoman Empire as one European empire. I'm dealing the Austro-Hungary, Germany, and Russia, besides the Ottoman Empire. And this collapse is creating a new reality that's was very accepted in the historiography. But the period of during the First World War, when the future was so unclear, and each of the agents tried to construct a future according to his understanding of his ideas or interest or whatever, and it encapsulates the ideas, brought them, the struggles between groups, between the political struggle, the military struggles, the ideological struggles that are shaping a new world and trying to shape something else. It marked the beginning of the new world, but it is also one more, I think, important thing that is very visible during the World War, but it's in the masses. many of what these mass movements were not so massive before World War. Yes, the nationalist movements were probably limited before World War. I am talking in general about many nationalist movements in East Central Europe, but they became massive during World War One. Also, of course, the political movements like socialism or these workers as a mass movement that were important maybe on the eve of World War One, but during World War One there are a new massive, impossible to not to see, and it is this mass politics. And it is really they really made a sea change, and it was so, I think, so massive and so visible and so big that even they themselves imagined them as massive before the war. Yes, that are. Their imagination about what happened before the war in some way duplicate the mass character of the movements during the war. But maybe I am not so answering your question.
No, I think this is really important. I would agree that one of the key moments is that when the war brings about the collapse of society, it's already the war. It's not only November 19 or November 18 or in the Russian case, well, November 17. But that this is already something that's happening through the war, and then people have to rethink in what kind of society do we want to live in. That on the one side, they have these progressive ideas, so they have a vision for the future, where they want to go, but at the same time they envision their future employing the terms and the concepts of their most immediate past. I think this is one of the key.
I would also add that the stereotype of the First World War is that something that it was is very stable, and the war changed several times during these 4 years or so. And also these changes during the war, the perspective that changed during the war also reshaped the ideas about what would be the future. Because the immediate past, it was not only the immediate past on the eve of the war, but the immediate past on the first months of the war or the first years of the war, with all the changes each period brought to the different societies that again reimagine themselves, and they try to adapt themselves on one side of the conditions, the actual conditions then, and on the other side their vision of the future, what future they want and what future they thought that it's possible. And I think that that in many cases we are addressing these ideas with an, I would say, idealistic approach, but they were very, very practical. And in some way, the future they imagine them as a very viable future. And when I am talking about the future, I am talking, of course, about what is a state and what will be the state here. Not so important if we are talking about Galicia, Congress Poland, or Lithuania. Which state will be here after the war? What kind of state? How this state will be connected to the other states? How will be the structure of this state, and how will be the structure of this state in a broader international constellation, and what will be the status of this broader constellation regarding what the big powers perceived at that time, because sometimes the big powers Germany, but in another setting it was Russia, yeah. or the Austrian Empire, that it was the big power from in many perspectives in 1915. Yeah.
I want to stay on that topic. You spoke about these ideas of what kind of state would be created, and aside from, if we leave Soviet Russia aside, it seems that the principle of ethnonationalism triumphed. Now, of course, this implied substantial problems for minorities, to those who did not subscribe to these ethno-national categories or did fall out of them. So one key demand by minorities, most importantly Jews, was the demand for national personal autonomy as a response to that. Could you explain a bit how people reached the conclusion that this would be a possible means of establishing good relations between majorities and minorities, and to secure the place of minorities in those new states?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say that, of course, these ideas of minority rights were in all over Eastern Europe, regarding the Jews, in all over East Central Europe or Eastern Europe, was very rooted in the main Austrian ideas, sometimes rooted in Adolf Fischhoff ideas, sometimes rooted more on Renner's ideas. The main idea was a kind of federation. It's which is also a logic that people on the eve of the First World War thought about states as federation of states, lands, yes, and this that means that some kind of limited sovereignty into a broader spectrum, either Austria or Russia, as a broader context. Yes, that's one point. But why this was regarded as a viable solution? In 1997, Simon Dubnow, the great Jewish historian, wrote a series of essays about. He titled the essays "Letters about Old and New Judaism," and he phrased, I think, very good in the fourth letter, why this idea is viable. And he wrote that it is impossible to create nation states, because in every way you will draw the borders of the states, always will be minorities, and you cannot create some kind of a nation state, because always will be minorities. And this idea of drawing borders between nations will create situations that will lead to ethnic violence, because if some place will be disputed between 2 or 3 ethno-national groups, it could lead to violence. And of course, violence is not, I would say, maybe using his argument, is not rational. People don't want this violence. It's noisy for everybody. That means that this idea of trying to create a system that will include all the groups, either minorities or majorities, it is the best way to solve this question. He also added that in the near future, the possibilities of building these kinds of states are diminishing, because all Europe in general, or the world Europe in particular, and the world in general, is being more and more heterogeneous because of the modernization and the migrations that are part of this process of modernization. That means that it's completely it's a stupid idea, he said, to think about nation states, as we. I would add, when he talked about nation states, in some way, he addressed the states that he imagined in places like the new created Greece, that place with a very strong ethno-national, ethno-religious, ethno-linguistic majority, with probably with no visible or prominent minorities. I am talking about Greece in the late 19th century, when it was smaller, before Thessaloniki, for instance, was included in the state. But it was how Dubnov, that never was visited Greece, imagined in the late 19th century a nation state. That is the reason that I think the people thought that the federation of minorities are a valuable solution to this question. And I think that it was the broader denomination of the Jewish political groups, because when the Bund, which is the socialist anti-Zionist Jewish national movement, thought about the Jews in Eastern Europe, the Jews in Russia, they imagined a kind of federation of nations, each one getting some rights that will accommodate them from the cultural point of view into the state. It was also how the Zionists imagined the future of the Jews in East Central Europe, and even German Zionists imagined in this way, in this particular way, the future of Jews in East Central Europe, of course, Eastern to Germany, when the war. The First World War I broke up. Yes, the group of prominent Zionists from, I would say, the first generation of Zionists in Germany, they even draw a program that imagined East Central Europe as a big state with no majority. Each of the groups will be it will be a minority, and will get some rights, political and cultural rights, according to these ethno-national, ethno-religious, or ethno-linguistic belonging. They did not imagine nation states as emerged from the Versailles new European order. They imagined federations of states, federation of nations. Yeah.
So they essentially deconstructed nationalism to a certain extent, or this nationalist paradigm that nation and state have to be the same.
Yeah, I think that they what is interesting, I would say the paradigm that nation and states are the same is maybe a result of World War I. I think, especially at least in the Jewish case, and I think that also in many ways in the Polish case, in the Lithuanian case, or even on the Ukrainian cases that I more or less are familiar with, the idea was this of a nation state completely sovereign. It was not there. It's an effect of the World War I, or result of the developments during the war. I think that the paradigm was that national belonging is an essential component in the human identity. In this way, they imagined that. I am not saying that. I am also repeating more or less they their idea, and every person belongs to one nation and only to one nation. And in order to be really equal in the state, their ethno-national identity, or they use the word national identity, should be addressed by the law and should be established and regulated in order not to discriminate somebody because he's ethno-national or ethno-cultural belonging.
I'll pick up on something you said a little bit earlier, the ideas of federations and the way or the concepts people had in mind when they were thinking about it. And so the question would be, when we put ourselves in the early years after the First World War or immediately after the First World War, what as both positive and as negative examples did people have in mind? So for in regard to federation, did they have the various compromises in the Habsburg Empire in mind? And in regards to what a nation state led by the titular nationality made for the titular nationality, what did they have in mind? Was it Germany, for example, and its treatment of Poles in the Posen region, or what were the positive and negative examples that people related to?
Okay, I think that of course they kept in their minds the two sets of examples. One would say immediate, and the second less immediate. First was the way they experienced their life in the empire they resided. The German Empire, in the case of Posen or Poznan, the Austrian Empire, in the case of Prague or Krakow or Lviv, or the Russian Empire, in the case of Warsaw or Vilnius. That is one set of experiences that were in their mind. The second one was their experience during the war. And I think that it was very... when they experience or more extreme, like in the case maybe of Krakow, when in 1918 was this pogrom, this violent experience was there, and it was in their mind. Not only the idea of this Franz Josef Austria. In the case of Warsaw, the experience under the German occupation and the way the German occupation manipulated the ethnic relations in Warsaw was more prominent than their experience under Russia. And the case in Vilnius is the same. Their experience under the German occupation was very, very different in Vilnius than in Warsaw. It was more prominent to try to reshape the actual conditions than the Russian experience. I would give one example that it is coming in my mind regarding Warsaw. During World War I but it was much prominent trend of discriminations against the Jews in the political level. And in many places in the press, in the Jewish press, you can read that in 1915 they say that this discrimination is part of a follow-up of the Russian experience. It's not a Polish issue. It is a Russian discrimination. Let's say the last waves of Russian discrimination. At the end of the war, they wrote exactly the opposite. It is it was our hope that the discrimination was only a Russian issue. It is not. It's also Polish. Yeah? That is the way they understood their experience, and they brought these two sets of experiences together and trying to understand what is going on now and how we should continue or should develop in order to become equal citizens. I think that it was the main point. I would even add that the struggle for national autonomy in places like Poland, Galicia, Congress Poland, Galicia, Lithuania, it was more and more stronger when they understood or they imagined the perspectives of the hegemonic national the hegemonic national movements in each place, or the hegemonic forces in each national movement, as making efforts to exclude them. More efforts to exclude the minorities, or the Jewish minorities in this case, brought to more strong, vociferous demands of national rights, minority rights, in order to defend themselves against discrimination.
Now, on paper, all these new states that were created then promised the equality of all citizens. How does this promise of liberal integrationist equality relate to the demand for national autonomy?
Yeah, I think that it is a point. This is a nice, I think, example of how the words are very, that the interpretation of the words and the concepts are so important, because the question was not if the state is giving equality. The question is, what is equality? And the equality is equality before the law for the citizens, and who is entitled to be citizen, and which kind. But equality before the law is a guarantee of equality, or it is only one aspect of equality? I think that the equality is a concept. It's a very contested concept during World War I, and we see how different it is interpreted in Soviet Russia, or in Poland, or even in Lithuania, or other Baltic states. For the Jewish minorities, and equality before the law, it was a way to discriminate them, because when the law, of course, is interpreted in the liberal Western way. If equality before the law is that everybody should rest one day in the week and the day is Sunday, that means that the law, the equal law, is discriminating those that are not resting in Sunday. But of course, on the other side of this contested concept of what is equality is the other side that is saying, but if you are not making one specific day as mandatory, what are you doing is to give less rights to the workers that would work every day in order to get some higher salary, and you are pricing those classes that are more rich. That's regarding the question of the day of the Sunday question that it was called in this region, or the question of the language. If you are allowing somebody to present his case in the court only in the only one official language, you are discriminating those that can express themselves freely in this language. Or if the official language is mandatory for those clerks working in every place in the country, even with people that are not talking the official language, that means that you are discriminating all the people that are speaking this Ukrainian, Yiddish, or Lithuanian language that are minority languages, even in regions or cities or towns that the minority language is more prominent than the official language. That's another set of the questions dealing with language. But on the other side, if you are allowing the use of the minority languages, but only in the border regions, far away from the city, far away from the more developed, so to speak, places with more economic possibilities. But you are not allowing them to open these schools in the main cities. Are you giving them equality? When you are recognizing this linguistic difference, or are we relegating them all the time to be in the margins of the society? This question is very complicated. I think it was broadly discussed in this period, and reaching some compromises in different places according to different ways of understanding, but it were, I think, big questions.
Fantastic. In these demands for minority rights and for national autonomy, and in the struggle for equality, in a new interpretation of equality, how did Jewish political movements and activists, how did they relate to other minorities in the region?
Okay, I think that they try to create some coalitions of minorities. But of course the question is, what is minorities? Which is, again, it's a social construction of minorities and majorities, because I would give you two different ways to address this question. But I would say the Jewish leadership tried to create some coalitions of minorities. Probably the most known coalition of minorities was what is called in interwar Poland the minority bloc. That to the elections to the first Sejm, that means the first after the constituent Sejm, a group, because a very discriminatory electoral law, the minorities created a coalition of all the parties of the minorities, I mean Ukrainian, German, and Jewish minorities, going together to the elections, and they gained very prominent results. And they imagined that through the block of minorities that were more or less, if you are talking about the Polish Sejm in 1921, is composed by four different groups, that only three, if you are combining three, you can get majority. They thought that through this minority bloc they could create a Polish state, not only in the ethnonational Polish meaning of the word, Polish state I would say in a civic meaning. That was maybe one example. Other example is probably the case of Lithuania, when at the beginning of this Lithuanian Republic, certainly in the very beginnings, I am talking about very late 1918 and 1919, when the borders of what is Lithuania were very not clear, Jews and Belarusians tried to create a broader Lithuanian state in order to include many Belarusians as possible, in order to create a nationality state, not a national state. The Lithuanian nationalists looked for a smaller Lithuania, and the other group for a broader Lithuania. I'm saying that because, if demographically speaking, these Belarusians were majority, or a relative majority, and the number was higher than the Lithuanian. And the case of Ukraine in 1917, 1920, maybe it's similar, because in some ways, in many ways, what we call the Ukrainians, ethnonational Ukrainians, were a minority in most of the cities in the Ukraine, while Jews and Russians together were the majorities. One third. So to speak, in these big cities in general, it's average, and this coalition that was created between Ukrainians and Jews, in some against the Russians, who were a minority, but were the hegemony in the Russian Empire. It functioned. I would say they were a sociological majority, despite that there was a demographic minority. This coalition between a demographic majority in the Ukrainian state, the Ukrainian, but sociological minority with the Jews or another minority, this created this special case of the Ukraine, this short-living Ukrainian Republic, where minority rights and autonomy were implemented during this period. So the main way to confront this question in this region was to create some kind of coalition of minorities, I would say.
Let's look on the practical level in the region. So when we look at the regulation of minority rights and also the forms of national autonomy that came about, we can see very different structures and outcomes in Lithuania, in Ukraine, in Poland, and Czechoslovakia. How can we explain these differences?
Well, we can explain it using many different tools. The first one was, I would say, the socio-demographic compositions of the world, especially of these groups that were considered agrarian minorities. Yes, in the case of Lithuania and the Ukrainian, this was considered the agrarian minorities became the entitled nations, and where these agrarian minorities created the state, this competition between it was more or less differentiated. It was easier to combine this agrarian nation, and with urban nation, so to speak, the Jews, and created more positive, I would say, conditions to accept this concept of minority rights. Again, because these demographic majorities were sociologically minorities, were not the dominant group before the war or before the collapse of the empire, the Russian Empire. The case of Poland is very, very different, because what we call Poles were very prominent also in the cities, and also in the general territories, and were more. Was maybe dominated in many ways by more, I would say, right-wing parties that for them was hard to compromise with minorities. But I can also add something about that. and maybe the strong history of, I think, that Polish national movements also was a factor, and they how on one way I would say the memories of this old big Polish power till the 18th century functioned as another factor. But we have to take into consideration that what emerged that during the war and even immediately after the First World War still were two big models that in the Polish national movement that struggled with each other. This, I would say, right-wing and Decia model that wanted a very nationalistic nation, a state that is serving primarily or maybe only the ethnonational citizens, and the other model, which was a little bit more inclusive, that it was the Pilsudski movement, the PPS, the Polish Socialist Party model that wanted a broader Poland that will include even Ukraine, that will give some rights to the other minorities, but it was a very paternalistic model. Because it was giving these lower classes ethno-national groups, maybe mostly Slavonian, Slavic groups, some rights, because they are not enough developed. It was a very paternalistic movement, but in any model. But in any case, there are two different models, and we have to take into consideration that these two models were fighting, struggling each with the other, till this more nationalistic right-wing model became the hegemonic model for the Polish state. Again, looking through these struggles inside the national movements, we can see how different could be the history if the people would make another choice.
Thank you so much. So we're coming slowly towards the end. Marcus, can you tell us a bit about your current work? What are you working on right now? What can we expect from you in the next years?
Okay. If talking about Polish national movement, I am working on the transference of motives between Polish national movement and the Jewish national movement, especially Zionism, and between Poland and Israel. I am focusing how main concepts enrooted in the Polish national movement and also in the Jewish national movement, especially Zionism, are two faces of Janus. In some way, they are the same way of thinking. In some way, come enrooted in very similar sources, but interpreted a little bit different. All the time, I would say, looking each to the other, and through the observation or perception of the other side, Jewish national movement, looking at the Polish national movement, and Polish national movement looking at Jews, let's say, in this way, or the Jewish experience, and how this perception is shaping their own ideas about their own national movement. To give an example, is how the idea of a nation without a state was interpreted in the Polish context after the partitions during the 19th century, through their perception of the Jews as perceived by big figures in the Polish national movement of the Jews, and how the Zionism in late 19th century, for instance, looked at the Polish national movement as some example to follow how to build the Jewish nation.
This is fascinating, and I think also incredibly topical theme, given also everything that we talked about before. So I have a follow-up question here related to the current situation, the current world we are living in. So do you think that we are seeing similar phenomena here, especially in Israel, in the relation between majority and minorities as we did in Eastern and Central Europe, in Poland maybe, in the early 20th century, in the late 19th century?
I think that
and may the answers and the strategies that minority activists employed back then be relevant for today? May they teach us something about our world today?
I think that in many cases, scholars are looking at the situation in Israel or the situation in Poland in the interwar period, if you want, or in the Habsburg Empire till the World War I, as structural different. It structures, but so it means that something that it is, I would say, not related to the human agency, but what through this. Through studying the transference of ideas, we can understand that these structures are created by people, that the structures are in their mind. Yeah? That is the reason that we can see some, I would say again, structural differences created by the people that are in some way, they have similarities between what's going on in other places or in periods, let's say, in very close periods. And how these ideas are transferred and retransferred. I would give maybe 2 or 3 examples to illustrate this idea. When the law of return was discussed in the Knesset, of course, after the establishment of the State of Israel, some of the people discussing this law experienced the discussion of a similar law of return in early interwar Poland, and in their discussion they refer to the oldest war they experienced in Poland. That in some way they are transferring, discussing it in a different way. The same regarding the question of minorities. Itzhak Grünbaum, one of the leaders, the Zionist leaders, or maybe one of the leaders of Polish Jewry in interwar Poland, that was very prominent in struggling for minority rights when the State of Israel was established, regarding the question of refugees, Palestinian refugees, should they return or not? He to reject the idea he supported in Poland, he again brought his Polish experience. 2 more examples that I think that are very interesting. One more is when after the assignment of the peace agreement between Israel and Egypt, and the question of the status of Palestinian was raised. Menachem Begin, at that time prime minister, who was raised in Poland, in interwar Poland, and was very, very aware of the Polish, I would say, political culture, he proposed the idea of autonomy. But when he talked about autonomy, what was in his mind was this: the autonomy of minorities in Poland, the project of autonomy of minorities in Poland. Yeah? Not the territorial autonomy the Palestinians imagined for themselves. that is another transfer that we can see. And maybe the last one that is very interesting is when, I would say maybe 20 years ago, it's of course not part of the study, but it's answering your question. Probably around 20 years ago, it was established a new Arab parties by Azmi Bshara, and he brought as a very important ideological component of his party the ideas of national autonomy, as was imagined by Jewish parties, but not only, in Eastern Europe. He was very aware of the Jewish demands for minority rights in East Central Europe, and he used that when he presented the main demands of his Arab party in Israel.
Absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much, Marcus, for taking the time to talking to us.
Thank you for coming and for giving me the opportunity to discuss with you this question that I know is it's a common interest between you and me.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.